Hey yo, everybody, I hope you're ready for some juicy, bizarre, Tennessee related drama today, because that's where I'm going with this one. So, hey everybody, how you doing? Steve the Amateur Story. Nobody cares. Those jackasses driving like that. Just want to remind them that they have no friends. They're gonna die alone. I think he's too far away to hear me. Anyway, it's July 5th, 2021. So y'all know what that means. It's a new day, a new story. But before we get to that, remember as always to like, share, subscribe. Hit up my Patreon if you haven't done that yet. I'm trying to post there at least twice weekly. And a lot of different forms of content. Lots of extra stuff there that you can only get if you become a Patreon supporter today. Even if you only got $1 to donate, you'll have access to all that stuff. And my friendship. The link to my Patreon is in the description with this video, as well as the links to my, as I try to climb over this fence, not rip my pants. In addition to my Instagram, Facebook, Reddit subreddit, and my TikTok. So all that said, we're going back to good old Knoxville, Tennessee for this one. This is a juicy story. So this has to be a typo. This could not have possibly been this guy's name, because this is a story that revolves around shenanigans in church, something I know all too well from my past. According to this article, a guy named Church L. Julian, that's the name given for the guy. His first name was Church. Only in Tennessee. I can't really say that, I've never been there. Anyway, so Church L. Julian is being brought into court by the Reverend of the church that he attended. So the Reverend Ralph A. Knight, as was his name, Reverend Knight, he brings Julian to circuit court. And here's why. And the title of the article says, well, this one thing actually isn't a problem, even though it's what kind of instigated this whole thing apparently. But the other thing that Julian did is, so here's what happened. Church service is going on, Reverend Knight's church. Julian is one of the many in attendance. And at some point, they don't state which part of the service this occurred in, but at one point, Julian just very loudly shouted, "Amen!" And apparently, this was deemed to be a distraction to the service, and it appears Reverend Knight told Julian to get out. He was being dismissed from the church for yelling "Amen." Yelling "Amen" in a church apparently is a distraction during church. That's a new one on me. So Julian is like, what the hell? He gets pissed. He walks up to the reverend of the church and socks him in the face. So as the article stipulated, shouting "Amen" in church is all right. Punching the reverend of the church is not all right. So that is why the reverend of this church in Knoxville, Tennessee, brought a guy named Church to court, which makes sense. You punch somebody, you can expect to be having a court date in your near future. So this is just the most as a beat up truck drives by me, it's like the most redneck stories I can find when you got a guy who's not allowed to say amen. That's enough to get kicked out of the church, and he ends up going up and punching the head preacher. I mean, where do you get this stuff, Knoxville? So it goes, this little court hearing for it, and Julian is apparently charged $25 in a fine. He doesn't go to jail or anything, even though he punched a man of the Lord, a man of the cloth. So I don't know, maybe the Reverend decided, I don't want him that. I don't want his life ruined by this, but I expect him to learn a little bit of a lesson for what he did. You don't punch a reverend. So, no jail time for Julian. He just had to pay a $25 fine, which, you know, a story coming out of, hell yeah, redneck brother. A story coming out, you know, 90 some years ago. $25 and a fine, that's a hefty fine overall. But I noticed one little sentence in this article that may possibly bear a little bit more significance than just being one general statement in the story. And it might possibly explain a pretty solid sense of unrest in this particular church. It may explain why Mr. Julian kind of went off his rocker a little bit. Maybe it wasn't just not being allowed to say amen. Maybe that was like a catalyst that finally triggered him, but there may have been like other stuff involved. And I almost get the vibes that this church was kind of being run with an iron fist. And I mean an iron fist beyond what more like stringent churches are like. So it could just be like, you know, it could have been one of these churches where you just really weren't allowed to do anything. You weren't allowed to say anything. You weren't allowed to look the wrong way. Every little thing you do is a sin, which is going to instigate issues in a church. So I almost get the vibes that Mr. Julian, this particular situation was probably the culmination of a lot of issues that were being had in the church. And the reason I think of this is because there's one statement that is printed in this story that states that Julian, in addition to 44 other members of the church, had recently been like kicked out, excluded from that church. 44 members. The church I went to for over a decade, we were lucky if we ever hit 30 people altogether. And this church, you know, it obviously was probably a pretty big one, and obviously a lot more people were going to church back in the day than they are now. But there had to be a lot of people going to this church for you to justify kicking out. You're not supposed to kick people out of the church unless there's very few specific, serious reasons why you ever make someone leave church. Because church is supposed to be about bringing people in and helping them and caring about them and loving them. That's what it's supposed to be about. So, you know, like I remember when I went to my church, we discovered that a guy that had been going to, we didn't know it at the time, but we discovered that a guy that was going to our church had actually been busted on like let's just say he liked children. And he'd been going to our church for 2 years and we never knew. And when we found out, we literally had to walk right up to him and say, hey, sorry, you have to leave. We had at least 3 girls that were like 15, 16 years old going to that church. So we walked up to him and said, you have to leave. So there are circumstances where you unfortunately have to tell people like you can't come to our church anymore. But 44 people? Again, I think this church was being run with an iron fist. I get the feeling that the Reverend was maybe not the most sympathetic, likable person in the world, and there probably was a lot of background stuff that ultimately culminated in Mr. Julian saying, you know what, this particular incident, this is it. I'm coming up and I'm going to get you one right in the face. So that's the vibe I get from this church, is that there was probably a lot going on behind the scenes that we didn't know about. And it's easy just to say, this man punched a reverend? That's despicable. How could you ever even think about doing such a thing? And it's like, maybe this guy had a little bit, I'm not saying go out and punch a reverend you don't like. I'm just saying there was probably a lot more behind this, and there was a lot more animosity and a lot more hostility that had been building up that really drove the events that happened in this story. It seems like this church was not exactly the best place to go to get in touch with the Lord in ways that were warm and welcoming and life-changing in a positive way. That's what I think. I don't know for certain, but that's the vibe I get. And that's the story of a man in Knoxville, Tennessee, who had enough, went up and punched the preacher man at his church and paid a $25 fine for it. You know, maybe it was a small price to pay. I don't know. So, as always, thank you so much for stopping by, for supporting this series, for supporting the channel, for supporting me. And as always, if you're new to the channel or you haven't done it yet, whatever the circumstances are, remember to like, share, subscribe to the channel, hit up my Patreon if you haven't hit it up yet. And again, there's a lot of stuff there for you to peruse if you become a Patreon supporter today. The link to that is in the description, along with the links to my Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Reddit subreddit pages. And all that said, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian. There's a bug on, no, it was a hair. Thought there was a bug on my arm. This has been Steve the Amateur Historian, and I'll see you tomorrow.